In the early hours of July 13, 1942, several hundred middle-aged men climbed down from trucks in the Polish village of Józefów. They were not battle-hardened soldiers. They were not fanatical ideologues. They were ordinary men, workers, artisans, salesmen, and clerks from Hamburg, Germany. Most were too old for combat service, recently drafted into Reserve Police Battalion 101. By nightfall, these men had murdered 1,500 innocent people, women, children, and the elderly. By the end of their 16-month deployment, this single unit of fewer than 500 men would be responsible for the deaths of at least 83,000 Jews. How does this happen? How do ordinary people become mass murderers? The question of how the Holocaust was possible has haunted historians, psychologists, and philosophers for over 80 years. When Nazi war criminals stood trial at Nuremberg, many offered the same defense. I was just following orders. Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the final solution, claimed in a 1962 letter that he and other officers were forced to serve as mere instruments. But was blind obedience really the answer? Could something so monstrous truly be reduced to people simply doing what they were told? In 1961, just 3 months after Eichmann's trial began in Jerusalem, a Yale University psychologist named Stanley Milgram set out to answer this question. The son of Jewish immigrants, Milgram had a deeply personal connection to understanding the Holocaust. He designed an experiment that would become one of the most famous and controversial studies in the history of psychology. Milgram's experiment was elegantly simple but profoundly disturbing. Participants believed they were taking part in a study about memory and learning. They were assigned the role of teacher and instructed to administer electric shocks to a learner in another room whenever that person answered a question incorrectly. The shocks started at 15 volts and increased in 15-volt increments up to 450 volts, marked with the ominous label XXX. The learner, of course, was an actor. No real shocks were delivered. But the teachers didn't know that. They heard screams, pleas to stop, mentions of a heart condition, and eventually, silence. When Milgram polled psychiatrists before conducting the study, they predicted that virtually no one would go beyond 300 volts, and that only about 0.1% would administer the maximum shock. Surely, they reasoned, ordinary Americans would refuse to harm an innocent person. The psychiatrists were devastatingly wrong. Every single participant administered shocks up to 300 volts. A full 65% continued all the way to 450 volts, the maximum, potentially lethal level. They did this despite visible distress, sweating, trembling, and objecting verbally. But when the authority figure, a man in a lab coat, calmly insisted that the experiment must continue, most people obeyed. Milgram had initially suspected that Germans might show uniquely high levels of obedience due to their culture. He planned to use American participants as a control group before testing Germans. But the American results were so unexpectedly high that he abandoned the cross-cultural comparison. The capacity for obedience to harmful authority, it seemed, was not uniquely German, it was disturbingly universal. What Milgram's variations of the experiment revealed was equally important. He discovered that obedience wasn't absolute. It was situational. When the teacher and learner were in the same room, obedience dropped to 40%. When teachers had to physically force the learner's hand onto a shock plate, only 30% continued. Distance, it turned out, made cruelty easier. When perpetrators could neither see nor hear their victims, obedience approached 100%. This finding has chilling historical parallels. The architects of the Holocaust deliberately created distance between perpetrators and victims. Guards at death camps often didn't see themselves as murderers. They were just following procedures, loading trains, maintaining order. The actual killing was done by gas, by others, somewhere else. Milgram also found that when the experiment was moved from prestigious Yale University to a rundown office building, obedience dropped from 65% to 47%. Authority wasn't just about the person giving orders. It was about the perceived legitimacy of the entire institutional framework. But laboratory experiments, however revealing, cannot fully capture the horror of historical reality. This is where historian Christopher Browning's groundbreaking work becomes essential. Browning examined the case of Reserve Police Battalion 101. Real men, real murders. These were not Nazi Party zealots. Most had joined the police force before Hitler came to power. They were middle-aged family men, predominantly working class, from Hamburg. They had wives, children, normal lives. Yet in Poland, they became killers. What makes their story particularly significant is what happened on that first morning in Józefów. Before the massacre began, their commander, Major Wilhelm Trapp, known affectionately as Papa Trapp, did something extraordinary. With tears in his eyes and a shaking voice, he explained the terrible orders they had received. Then he made an offer. Any older man who didn't feel up to the task could step out. This was not the Milgram experiment. There was no scientific authority figure pressuring them. There was no immediate threat of punishment. In fact, they were explicitly given permission to refuse. Out of approximately 500 men, only about a dozen stepped forward. The rest participated in the massacre. By the end of the day, 2,500 people were dead. So if it wasn't just following orders, what was it? Browning's analysis revealed a complex web of psychological and social factors, conformity and peer pressure. The men of Battalion 101 didn't want to appear weak in front of their comrades. They didn't want to be seen as cowards. Those who initially refused to participate often felt isolated, stigmatized as too weak for the work. The social pressure to conform, to be part of the group, proved extraordinarily powerful. Role adaptation. Over time, the men adapted to their roles. What was initially horrifying became routine. The language they used shifted. Killing became actions, victims became pieces. This linguistic distancing helped them psychologically separate from the humanity of their actions. Moral transformation. Perhaps most disturbingly, many perpetrators didn't remain troubled by what they did. 3 distinct groups emerged within the battalion. A core of eager killers who volunteered for execution squads, a larger group who performed their duties reliably but without initiative, and a small minority who found ways to avoid participation without facing consequences. The battalion's efficiency never decreased regardless of individual participation. The killing continued with mechanical precision. Dehumanization. The victims were presented not as individuals, but as collective threats, as problems to be solved. Anti-Semitic propaganda had done its work, portraying Jews as the enemy responsible for Germany's suffering. This ideological framework provided a justification structure that many perpetrators internalized. Incrementalism. The men didn't start with mass murder. They began with expulsions, then deportations, then smaller-scale shootings, gradually escalating to systematic slaughter. Each step made the next one seem less extraordinary. This is what one scholar called the normalization of torment. Recent psychological research has complicated Milgram's original interpretation even further. New analysis of his experimental records reveals that many participants did not simply obey mindlessly. They believed they were contributing to a greater good, to the advancement of science. They identified with the experimenters' goals and saw themselves as part of a worthy project. This engaged followership model is deeply troubling because it suggests that perpetrators aren't just passive automatons following orders. They're often active participants who believe in the mission, who creatively solve problems to achieve objectives, who take initiative in pursuit of what they see as a righteous cause. Historical evidence supports this darker conclusion. Many Nazi perpetrators didn't just follow orders, they exceeded them. They volunteered for killing operations. They devised more efficient methods of murder. They were, in Heinrich Himmler's chilling phrase, working toward the Führer, anticipating his desires and acting on their own initiative to fulfill them. Adolf Eichmann himself, when examined more carefully by historians, was not the mindless bureaucrat he claimed to be. He was a zealous believer in Nazi ideology who took pride in his organizational accomplishments and showed initiative in solving the Jewish question. The sociologist Zygmunt Bauman wrote, "The most frightening news brought about by the Holocaust was not the likelihood that this could be done to us, but the idea that we could do it. This is the uncomfortable truth these studies force us to confront. The perpetrators of the Holocaust were not monsters from another species. They were human beings with the same psychological architecture as the rest of us. We all have the capacity for conformity to group norms, deference to authority, moral disengagement when harmful acts are framed as necessary, dehumanization of outgroups, adaptation to roles that initially seem foreign to our nature. The factors that led ordinary men to become killers are not unique to 1940s Germany. They are universal human vulnerabilities that can be activated under the right, or rather, the wrong conditions. Understanding the psychology of Nazi obedience is not an academic exercise. These mechanisms still operate today. We see conformity pressure in corporate malfeasance, where individuals participate in fraud because everyone else is doing it. We see dehumanization in ethnic conflicts around the world. We see authority worship in cults and authoritarian movements. We see moral disengagement in military atrocities. The Holocaust represents an extreme manifestation of ordinary psychological processes. That's what makes it so terrifying and so important to understand. The historian Christopher Browning concluded his study with a sobering observation. These men were acting less out of fear or coercion than from motives as insidious as they are common: careerism, peer pressure, and the desire to avoid social discomfort. The lesson is not that we're all potential mass murderers. The lesson is that under certain conditions, ideological indoctrination, dehumanizing propaganda, authority structures, group pressure, gradual escalation, and the removal of normal moral restraints, ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil. Recognizing these psychological mechanisms is the first step in resisting them. When we understand how conformity works, we can resist it. When we understand how dehumanization functions, we can fight it. When we understand how authority can be misused, we can question it. The men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 remind us that the capacity for evil is not located in some other category of humans. It's a potential within the human condition itself. And that means preventing future atrocities requires constant vigilance, not just against monsters, but against the ordinary processes that transform ordinary people into perpetrators. As we face our own era's challenges, polarization, dehumanizing rhetoric, authoritarian appeals, and pressure to conform to dangerous group norms, the lessons from this dark chapter of history have never been more relevant. The question isn't whether it could happen again. The question is, what will we do to ensure that it doesn't?